Hello, fellow cyborgs, and welcome to my April reading wrap-up. Today, I'm going to be talking about the books that I read and reread in April that were not part of my TBR Clear Out readathon. I will link my wrap-up video for that readathon down below so you can see what else I read in April. The two rereads I want to talk about here because I don't have a whole ton to say about either of them, and I thought I'd just tack them on at the end. Let's start with not rereads first, though. I buddy read Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor with M.A. Anders. I listened to the audiobook. It was one of the audiobooks that I had on my device for ages and hadn't gotten to. I didn't like this. I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. There was too much teenage angsty drama, too many overly descriptive descriptions. The pace was weird, it sped up and slowed down whenever it pleased, and there was just so much unnecessary rape. I definitely think I am not the target audience for this book. It's possible that I have aged out of my love of Laini Taylor, but I enjoyed her Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy far more than I did this. I will not be reading the follow-up book. This is a duology, and by the end of this book, Emma and I were both kind of hate reading it. Sorry if this is one of your favorites, but it was not one of mine. Another book that I did not enjoy was Gareth L. Powell's Fleet of Knives, which is the sequel to Embers of War. I listened to this audiobook, which probably didn't help its case. I had 2 main complaints with Fleet of Knives. One was the pacing. The short, snappy chapters just accentuated how little actually happened within this book. It seemed as though the characters were pondering, talking about in the process of solving issues for many, many pages. Another reason was I thought there were gratuitous amount of deaths in here. Their sole function seemed to be to emotionally manipulate the reader. I didn't see that they were truly justified. And my final bonus reason had to do with a character change. So in the Embers of War series, you have different chapters from different crew members' perspectives. I like this. In Embers of War, one of the perspectives is Ashton Child. He's arguably the only male perspective because I'm not quite sure what Nod the alien's gender would be. However, in Fleet of Knives, Ashton's perspective is not there at all, and he's conspicuously replaced by the other only male perspective, Johnny. The entire time I was listening to Fleet of Knives, I kept thinking that Ashton Child is gonna pop in at any moment so we know how he's doing. If Powell did his job at the end of Embers of War, we would have been invested in this character. I want to know what happens next. Never did Ashton Child pop up in Fleet of Knives. And on top of that, the character arc that Johnny goes through, no spoilers here, would have had a lot more payoff if we had seen him before all of the traumas of Fleet of Knives happen. His character goes through an arc of maturity, but we don't get to see his immature self to begin with. So this arc is almost meaningless. I left the book thinking, I wish that we had had Johnny's perspective in Embers of War so that his arc would have felt like it mattered in Fleet of Knives, or that we would have just followed Ashton, continued to follow Ashton in Fleet of Knives and not add a new character. It was very weird, I didn't understand, and I ended up giving this 2 out of 5 stars. I then read The Sundial by Shirley Jackson, and I loved this. This is the first work by Jackson that I have truly loved, even though in my mind she exists as one of my favorite authors. It's weird. I believe I told you this is an apocalyptic novel, but it's actually more a pre-apocalyptic novel. This centers around a family who lives in this large estate. One of the family members has received a premonition that the world is going to come to an end, but those in the house will remain safe. And then we kind of see what the fallout is from there. Like most of Jackson's work, this reminds me of looking at a vintage 1950s photograph, but where something is a little off. I can imagine all of these characters just looking beautiful in their different outfits and hairstyles and everything like that, but they're all kind of awful people. The house itself, very quintessential Jackson, becomes a bit of a ghoul itself. I loved these scenes. So this was creepy and touching at turns, compulsively readable, so manipulative, but in the best way. I buddy read this with Acacia Ives, and she thinks that this probably would have been my favorite Jackson no matter what, but reading it during a time of trauma and crisis, as we're right now during the pandemic, heightened my reading experience. I'm so glad that I bought and read this when I did. It was certainly a joy. So needless to say, I highly recommend. I also listened to the audiobook of the collected Schizophrenias Essays by Esme Wei-Jun Wang. This comes highly recommended by Acacia Ives and also Natalie from Curious Reader. Even though the subtitle is Essays, this did feel very much more like a memoir of Wang's. It talks about her realization that her diagnosis of bipolar disorder was not complete, and that she had in fact one of the schizophrenias. She talks about how this has intersected with her life, how it has complicated it, and how she had missed the signs growing up. This was incredibly well written, and it was also narrated by Wang herself. This was a really powerful and moving experience. There was so much hurt, but also so much hope and healing in this collection. If you are interested in schizophrenia, interested in memoir, interested in a powerful book, I highly recommend. So let's talk about the 2 books that I reread in April. This is The Awakening and Selected Short Stories by Kate Chopin. I buddy read this with Acacia and also Sarai from Sarai Talks Books. I have given this 3 out of 5 stars the 2 other times that I have read this book. So this is my 3rd reading experience, and I definitely enjoyed this reading experience the most so far. I was amazed that I had not remembered half of The Awakening, which is a novella. This time I listened to the audiobook of both The Awakening and all of the short stories, and I did enjoy that experience, though I don't think that I read as closely this time as I had previously. And I think when I reread this again, because I will be rereading this probably throughout my life, that I prefer reading it physically. However, this time around, I did really appreciate the atmosphere that Chopin was able to create. I also really enjoyed trying to decide what I thought about the ending, which is kind of ambiguous as how it's supposed to be framed. Mostly though, I appreciated these short stories so much. I didn't love any of them, but I remembered nothing about them the first time that I read them, and so it was nice to finally remember what they were about. A lot of her short stories are quite short, like nearly flash fiction size, which I just found incredibly refreshing. I definitely want to try more by Chopin, especially more of her short stories. So this definitely was an enjoyable rereading experience, and I did enjoy listening to it on audiobook, but I think next time I would prefer to read it physically so I can dig my teeth into it a little bit better. And I did reread Embers of War by Gareth L. Powell in preparation for listening to Fleet of Knives. I listened to the audiobook of this, whereas previously, the first time I read it, I read my physical copy. I did not really enjoy the audiobook experience, though I enjoyed how the audiobook gave me the freedom to read this more quickly than I would have been able to in the physical form. There are different narrators for the different points of view in this book, and one of the narrators, the one who was for Ona Sudak, really got on my nerves. So because of that, the audiobook experience was not all that pleasant, and therefore the rereading experience was also not very pleasant. So I did demote Embers of War from the 5 stars I gave it originally to 4, and having since read Fleet of Knives and really not enjoyed it, I'm really nervous what I would think about this if I physically read it in the future. I definitely am more disappointed though in my experience with Fleet of Knives and how poorly that went with me than I am about demoting this from 5 to 4 stars. I'll talk about my opinions on these demotions in an upcoming Hindsight is 2020 check-in update video, even though I really just want to go off on a tangent right now. So I still enjoyed this, and I am glad that I reread it before jumping into Fleet of Knives because the plot is quite a bit complicated and it was nice to have everything fresh. So that's the rest of what I read in the month of April. It ended up being pretty darn productive. There are some other things that I finished in April, but I will be talking about them in upcoming Hindsight is 2020 videos. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, continue to be lovely.